Let's look at how your fantasy or science fiction world could be measuring time. This is a subject that can be very confusing, but very, very interesting. So let's get to it. Welcome back to another world building episode where today we are going to talk about time, how to measure anything from eras to seconds. And if you're interested in world building, don't forget to subscribe because this is only one topic in a very, very long series on world building for fantasy and sci-fi that you'll find on my channel. How do we measure time? Years, months, weeks, days, hours, minutes, seconds? Does your world have these, and how long are they, and what are they called? I'm gonna address the length first because it's not something that I tend to experiment with in fantasy too much. I tend to keep a year roughly the length of a year of our world. In science fiction, you have more reason to experiment with that, and if you do, just remember to be very, very clear about it. If your story is set on a planet that takes a very, very long time or a very short time to go around its sun, then you need to be clear about that from the beginning, because if you're mentioning that you have a character that is 30 years old and just hitting puberty or dying of old age, the reader needs to be already aware of how different time is in your book compared to the world that we all know. So it's a very fun thing to do. I love it when books do that, but they need to be very clear about it. And that's really all I have to say about the length of your year or your month or your days or anything like that. You can experiment with it, try to make sure that it's grounded in science, and be very clear about it in your story. The next topic I want to talk about is terms. What do you call these things? Do you say a year, a month, a day? You get the gist. For a year and a day, I always use the same terms. I always say a year, I always say a day, because otherwise things get very confusing, especially if you want to talk about days, but it's not called a day, so it's not daytime and possibly not nighttime, and it's a whole can of worms that I am not willing to open. As for month, I tend to go for month or something similar. In my main fantasy world, I call a month a moon or a moon cycle, and I call a week a moon phase or just a phase. Or at least, a rough estimate for what a week and a month is. It's a little bit complicated because while their year is the same length as ours, more or less, they base their month on the actual moon cycles, which means that there are actually 13 months or moon cycles in a year. And it's a whole complicated thing, and I'm not going to get into it here, but if you are interested in a video about the calendar that I created for that world, let me know in the comments, because I think it's very interesting. It's just a bit, too complicated for this overview. So let's move on. We're talking about terms that you use to describe time as time moves on your fantasy world or science fiction world. And if you're going to use terms that we're not familiar with, it helps to understand what it is you measure and how you measure it. So a year is the time it takes for a planet to revolve around its sun, or potentially for the moon to revolve around the planet if your world is the moon. And that's interesting, but yeah. A month is usually based on the moon cycle, again, unless your world is a moon, in which case a month would actually be maybe what they call the year. I'm not getting sidetracked. The point is, if your world doesn't have a moon or has two of them, the month measurement is probably going to be a little bit different. They would still have a month or something like that, though, probably to be able to split the year up into more manageable pieces than just year and day. You kind of need something in between there. And then we get to hours and minutes and seconds. And these are the really interesting ones, at least for this particular topic. And this is also where fantasy tends to get a little bit more creative, sometimes in a good way and sometimes not in such a good way. So having 24 hours in a day like we do is completely arbitrary. So is having 60 minutes to an hour or 60 seconds to a minute. Those are just numbers that someone came up with. I don't know how that happened, but probably logic behind it, but either way. The point is that you might come up with a different way to split your day up in chunks, and you might have 30 hours or whatever you call them in a day instead of 24. Of course, again, if you do that, be careful, your readers might be confused. I also want to mention that in a fantasy world, if it's based on medieval time or earlier times than that, before you had clocks really as an everyday thing, people in general probably did not think a whole lot about seconds, maybe not even minutes, because they had no way of measuring that. So maybe you don't actually need to have a smaller measure than an hour and just say a quarter of an hour or a tenth of an hour or something like that to indicate shorter spans. And if it's, just seconds, you can just use the word moments instead. It's a pet peeve of mine. I don't like, even when I find myself doing it either, that someone thinks about seconds when they shouldn't really have a concept of how long a second is. Anyway, me, I do tend to have 24 hours in a day and 60 minutes to an hour and 60 seconds to a minute in all of my fantasy works because I don't need to confuse my readers more than I already am. In a fantasy, readers are already putting a lot of effort towards understanding the society that you've created, the different creatures you've come up with, the magic systems, and everything like that. They don't need to also worry about how many hours are in a day. I also usually call my hours, minutes, and seconds just that, hours, minutes, and seconds. I don't usually come up with different words for it, partially because of a very traumatic experience I had as a child. So I was reading a book, and I don't remember which book it was, but hours, I think, was called guards. That is how they measured their time in that world. They had guards. But when I read the sentence that that was the longest guard he had ever experienced, that just completely threw me out of the story because it was just so weird. I didn't understand it at all. It didn't help that I was reading it in Swedish as well, where longest guard could mean either longest guard or tallest guard. So the sentence made sense all the way until the last word, and then it was just wrong. So because of that traumatic experience, I went for a long time saying that no, you can absolutely not change what an hour is called. I've changed my mind now. You can absolutely do that. It can even be done well, and it can tell both you and the reader a lot about the world. As an example of what I mean by that, the story that I mentioned earlier where an hour was called a guard, that time measurement was based on changing of the guards, presumably. I don't remember, but I'm assuming that that was the case. And to me, that means that that culture placed a lot of importance on military. Whether it's for defense or offense, a military force was so important in that world, in that culture, that they named a time measurement after it. That says a lot. Namely, it indicates that that culture had a very violent history. As another example, somewhere in my mind, and I don't know if this is from a story that I've read or if I've made this up entirely on my own, but I have the concept of calling a second a drop. And this tells me that the culture where that comes from values water. The measurement is probably originally the time it took for a drop of water to travel a certain distance or something like that. And the same culture might call a minute a spray because multiple little drops of water form a spray, and an hour could be called a goblet because of how many drops it takes to fill a standard-sized goblet. And all of this might come from the way that this culture, or someone that was very important in this culture, measured time. For this one, I envision a cave where a prophet lived and water dropped from the ceiling, and this prophet measured time based on how long it took for that dripping to fill her one goblet of water so she could take a drink. And the culture probably doesn't measure their time in drops of water anymore specifically. Maybe some temples have built like a clock that actually does drip water at the same rate as a drop is supposed to be and fills a goblet of water, and that's probably a standard-sized goblet of water, a goblet that takes 1 hour or one goblet to be filled from one of those kinds of clocks. But people in general, probably if they measure time in any way that doesn't come from the temples, and the temples are telling them that one goblet has now gone by, they probably measure with clocks the same way as we do, or as we have during the history of our time. It's based on the sun and the sun's movements over the sky, probably. Now, it might have either been split into how many goblets this dripping would fill in a day, or they wanted to split the day into 24 chunks, and they have now decided that one of these chunks is called a goblet. It doesn't matter if this prophet's drops or goblets or something was a lot longer or a lot shorter. They've just adapted it to function in the society that they've created. But the point is that they're probably still calling it drops and sprays and goblets because that's where it came from. Now, to be clear, and I want to be very, very clear about this, you do not have to go that far to explain your time measurements, not even to yourself, and certainly not in your book. This is not something that you should put in your book, because if you can make it natural that your characters would talk about it or think about it, then maybe, but easiest thing to do is just not to put it in your book and just possibly have it in the back of your mind, but you do not need that much detail, even in the back of your mind, to why they measure time in a certain way. The point is that this will still tell yourself and your readers a lot about your world. If you call a second a drop, if you use the drop and spray and goblet, they will know, your readers will know as well as you, that water is or has been very important. And that implies a measure of depth in your world that you might not have, but that's okay. Doesn't matter. You don't need to have it. As long as you imply it and your readers believe it, that's all you need. And honestly, I am now so invested in this measurement of drops and sprays and goblets that I'm going to have to use it for a story, potentially a story that I'm currently writing where it could actually fit. So yeah, why don't we make this an exercise? I have now explained the measurement of a drop and spray and goblet. Let's see you come up with a time measurement of your own and describe how it came to be, why they call it this. And if you don't know where to start with the word stitch. This culture calls something a stitch. It could be a second or a minute or an hour or a year or whatever it is, but that's the word you've got to work with if you want to. If you don't have your own word that you want to work with, that's perfectly fine too. Either way, let's see in the comments what you come up with. What does this word measure and why? In as much detail or as little detail as you want. I'm just interested to see what you come up with. I also just want to remind you again that if you're using a different word to measure time, especially if it's a word that already means something, like a guard or a drop or a stitch, you have to be very clear in the beginning of the story that these words have these additional meanings. Otherwise, you risk traumatizing someone. Now, let's move back a little bit. I want to move back to years and specifically the cycle of a year. When, for example, does a new year start? In our world, the middle of winter or the beginning middle of spring is fairly common for a lot of cultures, so that could be something to consider. Generally, in the middle of winter, if you're somewhere where you have snow and very long, cold, dark winters, you want some sort of party in the middle of the winter just to have some fun. And this doesn't have to be your new year, but it could be. Spring is also logical because that is when the snow melts and you can start planting crops and things start to grow again and life comes back, and that's, you know, it's a new beginning. Could very well be a new year. Makes sense. That said, you could put your new year anytime in the year as long as something significant happens or did once happen around that date. So some examples, if you don't want to put it in the middle of the winter or in spring, it could be in the beginning or end of a dry season or a rainy season or a windy season or anything like that. Or it could be around the time every year that your planet passes through an asteroid field, so you've got falling stars all over the sky. That's a pretty, yeah, I would put some sort of festival there at least. But it also doesn't have to be related to nature when you put your new year, that is. The date when your new year is celebrated could have to do with nature, or it could have to do with an event in your world's history when time is counted from. And that could be with every single new ruler, or it could be with a very important first ruler of the country, or anything really that affected the society. So if in your fantasy world you're saying that the year is 1349, then something important happened 1349 or 50 years ago. Now again, you don't need to know what happened, you don't need to know anything more than that something important happened there, or someone has attributed something important to a certain point in time. But personally, I do like coming up with at least the myth behind why we started counting time at that particular date. And that's especially if I want to put New Year's somewhere where it is not natural to have a New Year celebration. So this could be with the birth or the death of someone very important, a prophet or a saint, or a very important king, the first emperor of this huge empire or something like that. It could also have something to do with a huge natural disaster, a volcano erupted and killed a bunch of people, and then we're starting a new year now and a new era because we don't want to remember that. Or something like that. There are many, many examples of what it can be. I'm going to give you even more examples in my next video, which is going to be a workshop where I'm going to create a time measurement for the world that I'm working on and give you more details and advice on how to apply the things that I've talked about now. So don't forget to subscribe and hit the little bell so you don't miss that video, and I will see you there.